What if I told you that the borders on today's map of Iraq, the wars that have defined the region for generations, and the conflicts that have shaped global oil prices and Western foreign policy were all drawn, in large part, by a handful of British officials sitting in London and Cairo over a century ago? The modern Middle East, as we know it, was not an accident of history. It was a deliberate construction, built on secret deals, military conquest, and the cold calculation of imperial ambition. How did a distant empire reach into the heart of the ancient world and redraw its geography so completely that its consequences are still felt in every headline today? In this documentary, we trace the entire arc of Britain's involvement in Iraq, from the dying days of the Ottoman Empire to the kings Britain crowned and the rebellions it crushed from the air, uncovering the full story of how London shaped a nation still living with the map it was given. For 3 centuries before a single British soldier set foot on Mesopotamian soil, this ancient land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers answered to Constantinople. The Ottoman Empire had swept into the region in 1534, when Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent wrested Mesopotamia from Safavid Persian control. What he claimed was no mere desert backwater. This was the cradle of civilization itself, the land of Babylon and Nineveh, of the great Abbasid Caliphate that had once made Baghdad the intellectual capital of the world. The Ottomans organized their new prize into 3 distinct administrative units, or vilayets. In the south, Basra sat at the confluence of the great rivers, its port facing the Persian Gulf and the trade routes beyond. Baghdad dominated the center, a city still carrying the ghost of its former glory. And in the mountainous north, Mosul presided over a landscape of ancient ruins and restless tribal peoples. 3 provinces, 3 very different worlds. Who lived in this mosaic? The answer was extraordinary in its complexity. Arab Sunnis held much of the administrative and merchant class, particularly in Baghdad. Arab Shia dominated the riverine south, and the holy cities of Najaf and Karbala, carrying a deep historical grievance against Ottoman Sunni authority. Kurds filled the northern and northeastern highlands, fiercely independent, governed more by tribal loyalty than imperial decree. Assyrian Christians had clung to their ancient faith in mountain villages for 2,000 years. Jewish communities, some tracing their presence back to the Babylonian exile, thrived as merchants and bankers across all 3 provinces. This was not a simple land. It never had been. By the 19th century, the empire that held all of this together was visibly crumbling. European observers had taken to calling the Ottoman state the sick man of Europe, and the diagnosis was not wrong. Istanbul's orders were ignored, reinterpreted, or simply never delivered to distant governors. Into this vacuum stepped local tribal leaders, sheikhs who commanded genuine loyalty and real military force, filling the spaces that Ottoman bureaucracy could no longer reach. Europe watched this decay with undisguised appetite. British merchants had long traded through the Persian Gulf. French interests shadowed every Ottoman weakness. And then came Germany, with an audacious plan that alarmed London above all others. The Berlin to Baghdad Railway, conceived in the 1890s, would have threaded German commercial and military influence directly into the heart of the Middle East. For Britain, which depended on stable overland routes to India, this was not merely a business matter. It was a strategic threat of the first order. The age of European imperial competition had arrived at the banks of the Tigris. And Britain, already watching Mesopotamia from its positions in the Persian Gulf, was about to move from observer to participant. The ground beneath Persia had been keeping its secret for millennia. In 1908, a British drilling team working for William Knox Darcy struck oil at Masjid Suleiman in the southwestern corner of the Persian plateau. The gusher that roared from the earth that May morning changed everything. Here, just across the border from Ottoman Mesopotamia, lay one of the largest petroleum deposits the world had yet discovered. And it raised an obvious, urgent question. If Persia held such riches, what might lie beneath the sands of the Tigris and Euphrates valleys? In London, the implications were absorbed quickly. But it was a single decision by a single ambitious minister that transformed the region's oil from commercial opportunity into imperial necessity. Winston Churchill, appointed First Lord of the Admiralty in 1911, arrived at his post convinced that the Royal Navy's supremacy was under threat. German shipbuilding was accelerating. The margin of British naval superiority was narrowing. Speed and firepower would decide the next war at sea, and coal-fired engines could no longer deliver enough of either. Churchill pushed through the conversion of the Royal Navy's capital ships from coal to oil between 1911 and 1912. The logic was compelling. Oil produced more energy per ton, required fewer stokers, and allowed ships to refuel at sea. The Navy that ran on oil would be faster, leaner, and more lethal. But coal Britain had in abundance beneath its own hills. Oil it did not. With a stroke of strategic brilliance, Churchill had made his country's greatest military instrument dependent on resources it did not control. The tangled politics of Mesopotamia's oil rights were already well underway. The Turkish Petroleum Company, formed in 1912, was a creature of competing European interests rather than any single vision. Deutsche Bank held a significant stake, reflecting Germany's ambitions along the Baghdad railway corridor. Royal Dutch Shell brought Dutch and British shareholders into the arrangement. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company, fresh from its Persian discoveries, shouldered its way in as well. The Ottoman government, nominally sovereign over the very ground these companies were negotiating about, watched from an increasingly weak position. Anglo-German rivalry ran beneath every clause of every agreement. Germany's Baghdad Railway project, which had alarmed British strategists since the 1890s, was now understood in its fullest dimension. Rails and oil together would give Berlin an economic and military reach into the Persian Gulf that threatened Britain's route to India. The two empires maneuvered through diplomatic channels even as their relationship deteriorated across every front. The matter came to a head in the spring of 1914. In May of that year, the British government under Herbert Asquith purchased a controlling stake of 51% in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company for just over £2 million. Churchill had argued the case in Parliament personally. Britain could not, he insisted, leave its naval future to the mercy of commercial interests or foreign powers. The state had to own the supply. It was a remarkable moment, a liberal government deliberately extending imperial control over a private company for reasons of naked strategic necessity. The concession that Anglo-Persian held ran directly toward Mesopotamia. The borders were close. The geology was connected. Everyone in the room understood that Persia was only the beginning. 4 months after that parliamentary vote, Europe went to war. And the calculations that had seemed merely strategic in May became existential by August. Britain's soldiers would soon follow its oil interests into the ancient land between the rivers. The news reached London on the 2nd of November, 1914. The Ottoman Empire had entered the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. For the strategists in Whitehall, the geography told the story immediately. The Tigris and Euphrates valleys, the oil fields of Persia just across the border, the vital pipeline running to the refinery at Abadan on the Shatt al-Arab waterway. All of it now lay in hostile territory. They had not waited for the declaration. British Indian troops from Expeditionary Force D had already moved. On the 6th of November, 1914, soldiers waded ashore at Fao, a low spit of land at the mouth of the Shatt al-Arab, where the combined waters of the Tigris and Euphrates finally met the Persian Gulf. The beach was flat, the air thick with salt and humidity, the Ottoman resistance thin. Within hours, a foothold existed. Within days, it was a bridgehead. General Charles Townshend's forces pushed north with surprising speed. The Ottoman garrison at Basra was under strength and poorly coordinated. On the 22nd of November 1914, British and Indian troops entered the city. Basra, the ancient port that Arab traders had called the gateway to the Gulf for centuries, was now in British hands. The immediate objective, protecting the Abadan refinery and its pipeline, had been achieved in under 3 weeks. The ease of it was intoxicating. The commanders rode home with a confidence that the early days perhaps warranted. The Ottoman forces they had faced were disorganized, their artillery outdated, their supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of desert. Against the disciplined units of the Indian army, battle-hardened and well-officered, they had struggled to hold the line. What followed was the logic of the partial victory, that dangerous condition where success breeds not caution but appetite. If Basra was secure, then Kurna, further north, would make the perimeter tighter. If Kurna, then why not Amara? If Amara, then Nasiriyah made sense as well to protect the western flank. Each advance looked reasonable from the position just behind it. Each new objective appeared modest when measured against what had already been taken. By the spring and summer of 1915, British and Indian forces were pressing up both river valleys. Amara fell in June. Nasiriyah, controlling the lower Euphrates, was taken in late July after sharp fighting in the marshlands, where the reeds grew taller than a man and the heat sat on the water like something solid. The soldiers who fought there remembered the insects as much as the enemy. Dysentery moved through the camps. The medical infrastructure designed for a limited coastal operation was already strained beyond its planning. But the victories kept coming, and with them came a creeping redefinition of the mission. What had begun as a defensive operation to protect oil infrastructure had quietly transformed into something more ambitious, a campaign aimed at the heart of Mesopotamia itself. Baghdad, 300 miles north of Basra, began to appear in the dispatches not as a distant abstraction but as a plausible prize. The officers who spoke of it most confidently had not yet seen what lay between them and the old Abbasid capital. They had not yet faced an Ottoman army fighting on ground it knew, supplied along shorter lines and stiffened by the knowledge that retreat led nowhere worth retreating to. The year 1915 ended with British forces deeper into Mesopotamia than any original plan had envisioned, committed to an advance that the logistical foundations could not yet support. The guns of Basra had opened a door. What waited beyond it would test the limits of imperial ambition in ways that London had not yet begun to imagine. The ancient arch of Ctesiphon had stood for 14 centuries when General Charles Townshend's men arrived beneath it in late November of 1915. The great Sassanid ruin rose from the flat Mesopotamian plain like a monument to the folly of overreach, the largest brick arch ever built by human hands, still standing after empires had risen and crumbled around it. The British soldiers who paused to look at it might have read the warning written in its stones. Most did not. Townshend had pushed north from Kut al Amara through October and into November, his force of roughly 11,000 men strung along the Tigris, supply lines thinning with every mile. The logic that had carried the campaign from Basra through Amara and onward now carried it here, to within 20 miles of Baghdad itself. The city seemed almost within reach. The temptation was almost irresistible. The Battle of Ctesiphon, fought on the 22nd of November 1915, destroyed that temptation in a single brutal afternoon. The Ottoman forces, commanded by the capable Nur ad-Din Pasha and numbering nearly 18,000, had chosen their ground carefully and fortified it deeply. Townshend's men took the first Ottoman line at terrible cost. They could not take the second. By nightfall, more than 4,000 British and Indian soldiers were dead or wounded. The force that had arrived confident left shattered, pulling back south in a fighting retreat that lasted days. Kut al Amara, a small town sitting inside a loop of the Tigris, was where Townshend stopped. He had intended it as a temporary position. The Ottomans had other plans. By the 7th of December, 1915, they had surrounded the town completely. The siege had begun. For 147 days, nearly 13,000 men waited inside a shrinking perimeter. The rations were cut, then cut again. Horses and mules were slaughtered for food. The summer heat approached 50 degrees Celsius, and disease moved freely through the crowded alleys of the town. 3 relief columns were sent south along the Tigris to break through. 3 times they were stopped, at Sheikh Saad, at the Wadi, at Dujaila. The cost of those failed attempts exceeded 23,000 casualties. More men lost trying to save the garrison than were trapped inside it. London tried everything. A young officer named T.E. Lawrence was dispatched to offer the Ottomans £2 million in gold to let the garrison go. The offer was refused. Food was dropped from aircraft in one of the first aerial resupply attempts in military history. It was not nearly enough. On the 29th of April, 1916, Townshend sent a message to the Ottoman commander Halil Pasha. The garrison was surrendering. It was the largest capitulation of British forces since the American War of Independence. 13,000 soldiers, British and Indian, laid down their arms. What followed was, for many of them, worse than the siege. The prisoners were marched north through the desert toward Anatolia, hundreds of miles in summer heat with little water and less food. Thousands died on those roads from exhaustion, disease, and the violence of their guards. Of the roughly 2,700 British soldiers taken at Kut, fewer than 800 survived captivity. The Indian soldiers fared somewhat better in raw numbers, but suffered enormously. The death marches of 1916 left a wound in the memory of the Indian Army that would not close quickly. The fall of Kut sent a shock through the British Empire that few single defeats had managed. It was not just the numbers, though the numbers were devastating. It was the image, the spectacle of imperial soldiers surrendering en masse to an Ottoman force that London had casually underestimated for 2 years. The prestige upon which British authority in Asia rested had taken a blow that demanded an answer. That answer would come, but it would take time to organize, and it would require a fundamental rethinking of how the campaign in Mesopotamia was being run. New commanders, new logistics, new ambitions would have to be assembled from the ruins of what Ctesiphon and Kut had destroyed. While British soldiers starved inside Kut and their would-be rescuers bled into the Mesopotamian mud, something else was happening far from the desert. In the carpeted offices of London, Paris, and Petrograd, diplomats were drawing lines across maps of a Middle East that did not yet belong to them. The soldiers on the ground were fighting one war. The diplomats were already planning the peace, and the two visions bore almost no resemblance to each other. The contradictions began with a correspondence. Between July of 1915 and March of 1916, Sir Henry McMahon, British High Commissioner in Egypt, exchanged a series of letters with Sharif Hussein bin Ali, the ruler of Mecca and guardian of Islam's holiest cities. Hussein commanded enormous prestige across the Arab world, and Britain needed him. An Arab revolt against the Ottomans would stretch the enemy thin, open new fronts, and help rescue the battered British position in the region. The price Hussein named was straightforward: British recognition of an independent Arab state stretching across much of the former Ottoman Arab lands, a kingdom for the Arab people who had long chafed under Turkish rule. McMahon's replies were carefully worded, deliberately vague, and almost certainly designed to promise more than London intended to deliver. But Hussein read them as a commitment. He launched the Arab Revolt in June of 1916, sending his sons and his fighters into the field against the Ottoman Empire on the strength of what he believed was a British guarantee of Arab independence. He had been reading the wrong correspondence. 2 months before Hussein fired his first shots, in May of 1916, a British diplomat named Sir Mark Sykes and his French counterpart François-Georges Picot had concluded a secret agreement that carved the same territory into European spheres of influence with the precision of men cutting a cake. France would receive Syria and Lebanon, a vast zone of direct and indirect control stretching from the Mediterranean coast deep into the interior. Britain would take Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, including the provinces of Basra and Baghdad. Palestine would fall under some form of international administration, with Britain holding the ports of Haifa and Acre. The Arabs who had just been promised independence would instead inherit European dominion. The agreement was kept secret from Hussein. It was kept secret from the Arab fighters then bleeding for British objectives in the desert. It would not remain secret forever, and when it was exposed, the betrayal it represented would echo across generations. Then came a third promise, layered over the first two like a document written in invisible ink. On the 2nd of November, 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour sent a letter to Lord Walter Rothschild, a leader of the British Zionist community. The Balfour Declaration, as it became known, stated that the British government viewed with favor the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. The same land McMahon had implied that Hussein might form part of an Arab kingdom, the same land Sykes and Picot had placed under international administration, was now the subject of a third overlapping commitment. 3 promises. 3 different audiences. 1 piece of territory. British officials understood, or should have understood, that these pledges could not all be honored simultaneously. The logic of wartime diplomacy, keeping France on side, keeping Hussein fighting, securing Jewish support in America and Russia, had produced a tangle of incompatible obligations that no post-war settlement could fully resolve. What drove these contradictions? Partly it was the desperate improvisation of a war going badly wrong. Partly it was imperial habit, the assumption that the details could be sorted out later once the fighting was done and Britain stood in a position of strength. And partly it was something more troubling, a genuine belief among the diplomats that the peoples of the region were objects of great power calculation rather than subjects of their own destiny. The soldiers and the statesmen had together built something in the years between 1914 and 1917, a structure of blood, broken promises, and buried agreements. Soon, a general named Frederick Mohd would march into Baghdad, and Britain would have to decide what to do with the empire it had quietly promised to at least 3 different people. The man tasked with salvaging Britain's broken campaign in Mesopotamia was not a gambler or a visionary. General Sir Stanley Mohd was something rarer and, in the circumstances, more valuable. A meticulous administrator with a soldier's instinct for preparation. Where his predecessors had advanced on hope and inadequate supply lines, Mohd would advance on logistics. Through the second half of 1916, he rebuilt the Mesopotamian force from the ground up. River transport was overhauled. Medical services, a catastrophic failure at Kut, were reorganized entirely. Troops were rested, resupplied, and retrained. The men who had watched their comrades surrender in humiliation needed to believe that this time the command structure behind them would not fail. Mohd worked to give them that belief, methodically, without fanfare. By early 1917, he was ready to move. The advance up the Tigris began in December of 1916. Grinding forward with the deliberate pressure of a force that no longer had anything to prove in a hurry. When Mohd reached Kut in late February of 1917, the Second Battle of Kut lasted only days. The Ottoman defenders, outflanked and overwhelmed, abandoned the town that had consumed so much British blood and pride. For the soldiers who had watched the first siege from the outside, who had thrown themselves at relief operations that never reached the men inside, there must have been something both satisfying and hollow about walking through those gates at last. But Mohd did not pause to dwell on it. Baghdad lay ahead, and the momentum was with him. On the 11th of March, 1917, British and Indian troops entered Baghdad, the city that Arab poets had called the navel of the world, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, the legendary capital of Harun al-Rashid, fell to an imperial army with almost no resistance. Ottoman forces had withdrawn rather than fight street by street through ancient alleyways. The news was celebrated in London with something approaching relief. After Gallipoli, after the Somme, after Kut, here at last was an unambiguous triumph. A great city had been taken. The map was changing. Mohd issued a proclamation to the people of Baghdad. Its most famous line declared that British forces came not as conquerors but as liberators, arriving to free the city from Ottoman misrule and restore dignity to a people who had suffered under foreign domination. The words were carefully chosen and widely distributed. They were also given the secret agreements already signed in London and Paris, something less than the full truth. The proclamation spoke of liberation. The Sykes-Picot Agreement spoke of British spheres of influence. Both documents existed simultaneously, and the men issuing the proclamation knew it. The triumphal mood would not last long. On the 18th of November, 1917, General Maud died in Baghdad. The cause was cholera, contracted at a dinner hosted by the city's Jewish community, where he had drunk contaminated milk. He was 53 years old, the man who had rebuilt a broken army and delivered Britain's greatest success of the Mesopotamian campaign was buried in the city he had captured 8 months earlier. His death was a strange, quiet punctuation mark on a moment that had seemed so decisive. Britain held Baghdad. It had promised that city and the lands around it to at least 3 different futures. The soldiers had done what the diplomats required. Now the diplomats would have to live with the consequences. And the consequences, as the war moved toward its close and the Ottoman Empire toward its dissolution, were growing more complicated by the month. The lines drawn in secret were about to become the borders of a new world. The guns fell silent on the 30th of October 1918, when Ottoman representatives signed the Mudros Armistice aboard a British warship in the Aegean Sea. The war, in the Middle East at least, was officially over. But Britain was not finished moving. General William Marshall, commanding British forces in Mesopotamia, had received orders before the armistice was even signed. Mosul, the great northern city sitting atop what geologists were beginning to suspect were extraordinary reserves of oil, was still in Ottoman hands. The armistice terms required Ottoman forces to withdraw from territory they occupied. Britain interpreted this creatively. Within days of the ceasefire, British troops were marching north to occupy Mosul, pushing past Ottoman forces who pointed, not unreasonably, to the fact that the fighting was supposed to have stopped. By the 14th of November, 2 weeks after the armistice, Mosul was under British control. The Ottomans protested. Britain kept the city. It was a revealing moment. The language of liberation and self-determination was already filling the air of post-war Europe. And yet here was an empire seizing a city after the war had ended, because it could and because the ground beneath that city might be worth an enormous fortune. The Paris Peace Conference opened in January of 1919 with Woodrow Wilson arriving from Washington carrying his 14 points like a scripture. One of those points promised the right of self-determination to peoples freed from imperial rule. The Arab leaders who had fought alongside Britain in the Desert Uprising, who had been promised an independent Arab state, listened carefully to Wilson's words. They had reason to hope. Their hopes did not survive contact with the conference rooms of Paris. Britain and France had no intention of surrendering their claims. The mandate system, crafted under the new League of Nations, offered an elegant solution to an uncomfortable problem. Rather than calling their control what it was, colonial possession, the victorious powers would instead act as temporary administrators, guiding less developed peoples toward eventual self-governance. The mandates were imperialism dressed in the language of trusteeship, and everyone in those conference rooms understood exactly what they were. The final accounting came at the San Remo Conference in April of 1920. Gathered in an Italian resort town, British and French diplomats divided the former Ottoman Arab territories between themselves with the calm efficiency of men sorting through inherited property. France received the mandate over Syria. Britain received the mandate over Mesopotamia, the territory that would soon be renamed Iraq, and over Palestine to the west. What Britain actually received were 3 Ottoman administrative provinces called vilayets that had been governed separately for centuries and that had remarkably little in common with one another. In the south lay Basra, predominantly Arab and Shia Muslim, oriented toward the Persian Gulf. In the center lay Baghdad, a cosmopolitan mix of Arab Sunni and Shia communities, Jews, and others, a former imperial capital with its own distinct identity. In the north lay Mosul, home to a large Kurdish population alongside Arabs and a variety of Christian minorities, connected as much to the mountains of Anatolia as to the river plains below. No plebiscite was held. No population was consulted. The 3 vilayets were merged by the stroke of a pen into a single entity whose borders followed the logic of British strategic interest rather than any cultural, ethnic, or historical reality. The people who would be required to share this new state had not chosen one another. Britain now controlled this invented country. It had promised it liberation. It had delivered instead administration. And the question of how to actually govern 3 million people who had not asked to be governed by London was about to become very, very urgent. The man charged with turning British ambition into British administration was Arnold Wilson, acting civil commissioner for Mesopotamia. Precise, confident, and possessed of an imperial certainty that bordered on arrogance, Wilson believed the solution to governing the new territory was straightforward. Britain should rule it directly, firmly, and without apology. He had little patience for the language of self-determination filtering down from Paris, and even less patience for Iraqis who expected the promises of liberation to mean something. Wilson's administration imposed heavy taxation, restricted local political expression, and filled senior positions with British officials rather than Arab ones. When, in the autumn of 1919, he circulated a questionnaire asking Iraqis what kind of government they preferred, the results were inconvenient. Many respondents wanted Arab self-rule. Wilson largely set the findings aside. Resentment accumulated like floodwater behind a dam. By the spring of 1920, the mood across Mesopotamia had shifted into something dangerous. The formal announcement of the British mandate at San Remo arrived like a match dropped into dry grass. This was not the temporary military occupation Iraqis had been told to endure. This was permanent, formalized, internationally sanctioned control. Arab newspapers in Baghdad filled with outrage. Tribal leaders across the Euphrates Valley began meeting in the reed marshes, away from British informants, and the conversations were no longer about grievances. They were about resistance. The revolt erupted in June of 1920, beginning among the tribes of the Middle Euphrates and spreading with a speed that shocked Wilson and his officers. What made this uprising genuinely alarming to the British was something they had not anticipated. Sunni and Shia Iraqis were fighting together. The 2 great branches of Islam, divided by 13 centuries of theological and political separation, found in the British occupation an enemy sufficient to unite them. Shia religious scholars issued rulings calling armed resistance a religious duty. Sunni tribal leaders answered. The mosques of Baghdad held joint prayers. The symbolism was extraordinary, and the military reality was serious. Across the summer and into the autumn, the British found themselves fighting an insurgency stretched across hundreds of miles of river country. Isolated garrisons were overrun. Supply lines were cut. Small units of British and Indian troops found themselves surrounded in towns with names London had barely heard of. The RAF, still in its infancy as an institution, deployed aircraft over the Euphrates Valley, bombing villages suspected of harboring rebels. Winston Churchill, serving as Secretary of State for War, discussed the possible use of chemical weapons on uncivilized tribes, a conversation that has never ceased to disturb historians. The suppression, when it came, was overwhelming and merciless. By the time the revolt was broken in the early autumn of 1920, more than 6,000 Iraqis lay dead. 500 British and Indian soldiers had been killed. Entire villages had been destroyed. The British had won in the narrow military sense of the word. But at what cost? The financial reckoning alone was staggering. Putting down the revolt had cost London £40 million, an almost incomprehensible sum for a country already strained by 4 years of World War. Questions that had once been dismissed in London were now being asked with considerable urgency. Could Britain afford to run Mesopotamia through direct administration? Could it sustain the troop numbers required to hold down a population that had just demonstrated, unmistakably, that it did not wish to be held down? Arnold Wilson was recalled. His confident certainty had produced a catastrophe. A new approach was needed and a new mind to devise it. The revolt of 1920 did not end British involvement in Iraq, but it ended one version of that involvement. The era of blunt, unvarnished direct rule was over. What would replace it, Britain hoped, would be something more elegant, more economical, and perhaps more durable. A kingdom with an Arab face and British hands guiding it from behind the curtain. The question of who would sit on that throne and how it would be arranged now felt one of the most extraordinary gatherings in the history of British imperial statecraft. They called it a conference. In practice, it was something closer to a design session, the drafting table on which a new Middle East would be sketched into existence. In March of 1921, Winston Churchill arrived in Cairo as the newly appointed colonial secretary, handed a remit that was essentially financial. The revolt had cost £40 million. London wanted that number to fall, dramatically, and Churchill was the man dispatched to make it happen. He brought with him some 40 experts, advisors, and officials, including T.E. Lawrence, the architect of the Arab Revolt, and Gertrude Bell, the scholar, explorer, and political officer who knew the tribes and towns of Mesopotamia more intimately than perhaps any other living Westerner. The Semiramis Hotel provided the setting. The Nile glittered outside its windows. Inside, in rooms thick with cigarette smoke and the particular confidence of people who believed they understood the world, Britain's Middle Eastern empire was reorganized in the space of a few weeks. Churchill's solution to the cost problem was elegant in its construction and audacious in its implications. Rather than administering Iraq directly, which required enormous troop deployments and the administrative machinery that had nearly bankrupted the enterprise, Britain would install a friendly Arab king. That king would provide an Iraqi face on the government, satisfying, at least nominally, the language of self-determination. British advisors would remain. British air power would enforce order. The costs would plummet. The control would persist. The candidate was Faisal ibn Hussein, son of the Sharif of Mecca and the man whom the French had just expelled from Syria after his brief attempt to rule in Damascus. Faisal had fought alongside Lawrence during the war. He was known, he was pliable, and he was conveniently available. Churchill offered him a throne, and Iraq became a kingdom by committee decision in a Cairo hotel. Gertrude Bell's influence on these deliberations was profound and, in many respects, underappreciated by history. She had spent years moving through Iraqi society, drinking coffee with sheikhs, corresponding with religious scholars, cataloging tribal allegiances with a precision that no map could capture. It was Bell who argued most forcefully for Faisal, Bell who understood which communities might accept him and which would require careful management. The borders that emerged from Cairo, placing Mosul's Kurds and Shia Southerners and Sunni Central Iraqis within a single state, reflected her assessments. Whether those assessments were correct is a question the subsequent century has answered with considerable violence. Churchill also settled another outstanding question at Cairo. Faisal's brother Abdullah had arrived in Transjordan with a small force, apparently intending to challenge French control of Syria. Rather than confront him militarily, Churchill offered a solution. Abdullah would govern Transjordan, the territory east of the Jordan River, under British supervision. A new political entity was thus created, almost as an afterthought, to solve an inconvenient problem. In the space of a few weeks, Faisal had been given Iraq, Abdullah had been given Transjordan, and the modern map of the Arab Middle East had been roughed into something approaching its present shape. Churchill reportedly called it a fine morning's work. What it was, in truth, was an empire rebranding itself. The mandate remained. The RAF bases remained. The British advisors remained. Only the vocabulary had changed, swapping the honest bluntness of direct rule for the more comfortable language of partnership and guidance. Faisal would need to be sold to the Iraqi people, of course. The referendum that followed his installation would produce a suspiciously unanimous result. But that particular exercise in managed democracy belongs to the chapter ahead. On the 23rd of June, 1921, a ship carrying Faisal ibn Hussein docked at Basra. He stepped ashore into a country he had never visited, whose people he did not know, whose languages, plural and competing, he barely spoke. He was 35 years old, recently humiliated by the French, and entirely dependent on British goodwill. Iraq, for its part, was being asked to accept a stranger as its king. The plebiscite that followed was a masterpiece of managed democracy. Tribal leaders were visited. Results were encouraged. When the numbers were tallied in August, 96% of Iraqis had supposedly endorsed Faisal's rule. The remaining 4% had presumably misunderstood the question. Gertrude Bell, who had worked furiously behind the scenes to produce this outcome, wrote in her letters with a certain weary candor about the mechanics of the exercise. Even she understood that the legitimacy being constructed here was thin, a paper crown pressed onto a borrowed head. Yet Faisal himself was no fool. He understood his position precisely, and he played it with considerable skill. The Anglo-Iraqi Treaty of 1922 formalized what the plebiscite had papered over. Britain retained control of foreign policy, military affairs, and finance. British officials sat alongside their Iraqi counterparts in every significant ministry, which is to say they sat above them. The RAF maintained its bases. The mandate, stripped of its name but not its substance, continued under a friendlier label. When the treaty was published, nationalist opinion in Baghdad erupted in fury. Faisal had been king for less than a year, and already he was being accused of selling the country he had only just acquired. His response was to resist the treaty. Privately. Cautiously. Just enough to signal to Iraqi opinion that he was not simply a British puppet, while never pushing hard enough to make the British actually remove him. It was a delicate performance, sustained over years, and it required constant recalibration. One of the more consequential decisions of this period was the construction of the Iraqi state itself. The Ottoman bureaucratic class, drawn heavily from Sunni Arab officers and administrators, provided the skeleton of the new government. Faisal recruited former Arab nationalist officers from the old Ottoman military, men who had fought in the Hejaz campaigns and shared his background in his politics. They filled the officer corps and the ministries. The Shia majority, the Kurdish north, the tribal peripheries, all found themselves governed by a state that regarded them with a mixture of suspicion and condescension. This was not an accident. It was a design choice, made partly for convenience and partly because the British understood that a narrow, manageable elite was easier to work with than genuine representative government. The Kurdish question presented particular difficulties. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 had gestured toward Kurdish autonomy. The Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 effectively buried it. Britain wanted Mosul, with its suspected oil wealth, inside Iraq rather than inside a Kurdish entity or Turkey. Kurdish aspirations were noted, filed, and set aside. By 1924, the shape of modern Iraq had been largely determined. Its borders enclosed incompatible communities. Its government represented one community substantially better than the others. Its king was simultaneously too foreign and too clever, straining against constraints he could acknowledge only in private. And beneath the diplomatic surface, the fundamental question of who actually controlled the country remained exactly what it had been since the fall of Baghdad in 1917. The next chapter in that question would be written in oil. Governing Iraq cost money Britain no longer had. The Great War had hollowed out the treasury, and the prospect of maintaining a full army garrison across a restless, sprawling territory was precisely the kind of expense that made politicians in Westminster reach for alternatives. Someone had to find a cheaper way to hold the country down. That someone was Hugh Trenchard, Marshal of the Royal Air Force and a man of absolute conviction. His argument was elegantly brutal. Instead of expensive infantry columns that moved slowly across difficult terrain, the Royal Air Force could project force anywhere in Iraq within hours. A village that refused to pay taxes, a tribal leader who challenged British authority, a Kurdish community that grew inconveniently restless, all could be brought to heel from the sky. No boots required. No prolonged campaigns. Just the sudden, overwhelming terror of machines appearing from the clouds. In 1922, the RAF formally replaced the army as the primary instrument of colonial control in Iraq. It was the first time in history that an air force had been given responsibility for governing territory. Trenchard called it air control. Others, more honest about what the word control actually meant, might have called it something else entirely. The campaigns that followed were systematic and merciless. Kurdish villages in the north were bombed when their leaders resisted incorporation into the new Iraqi state. Arab tribes in the Euphrates basin were struck when they refused demands from Baghdad. The RAF developed techniques specifically suited to the task. Delayed action bombs were dropped so that villagers returning to assess damage would be caught in secondary explosions. Livestock were targeted to destroy the economic foundation of tribal communities. Night bombing was introduced to prevent populations from simply evacuating before aircraft arrived. What did it look like from the ground? The roar of engines before anyone could see anything. Then the shapes appearing against blue sky or breaking cloud. Then fire, and the particular silence that follows catastrophe. The human cost of these campaigns was deliberately obscured, then forgotten. British military reports measured success and compliance achieved in tribes pacified in cost per sortie. They did not reliably record civilian deaths. The people dying beneath these raids left no archives, no official correspondence, no letters home to be published in newspapers. They were, in the terminology of the time, simply tribes. The erasure was built into the language from the beginning. Winston Churchill, then Secretary of State for War and Air, went further than bombs. In 1920, he had explicitly raised the question of using chemical weapons against what he called uncivilized tribes, arguing there was no need to be sentimental about their use. Whether or not mustard gas was actually deployed in Iraq remains historically disputed. What is not disputed is that Churchill considered it a perfectly reasonable instrument of colonial administration, and that his enthusiasm for the idea alarmed even some of his colleagues. The doctrine of air control worked, in the narrow sense that British authority was maintained and the costs were reduced. By 1932, when Iraq was granted formal independence and admitted to the League of Nations, Britain could point to a decade of relatively cheap governance. What the ledger did not record was what had been purchased with it, and at whose expense. These campaigns were not secrets exactly. They were reported, briefly, in military journals. They were discussed in Parliament occasionally. Then they sank beneath the surface of British memory, absorbed into a general silence about the nature of empire that would take generations to begin lifting. The precedent, however, did not disappear. The logic of air power as a tool of political control, of bombing civilians to produce compliance, would echo through the century in ways no one in 1922 fully anticipated. Beneath the diplomatic progress of Iraq's nominal independence lay something that would prove far more consequential, the question of what the country actually rested on. Beneath the politics of tribes and aircraft, beneath the drawn lines on colonial maps, something far older waited in the earth. The question was who would control it. Turkey had never accepted the post-war settlement quietly. The old Ottoman vilayet of Mosul, a vast territory stretching into what is now northern Iraq, remained bitterly contested after the treaties of the early 1920s. Ankara argued with considerable historical logic that the region was rightfully Turkish. Kurdish leaders, watching both sides negotiate over land their people had inhabited for centuries, pressed their own claims for something different entirely, an independent homeland that neither Britain-Turkey nor the new Arab government in Baghdad had any intention of delivering. The League of Nations stepped into the dispute, dispatching a boundary commission to assess the question on the ground. Its report, delivered in 1925, recommended that Mosul remain part of Iraq, but attached a condition that would quietly be forgotten in the years that followed. Britain would need to maintain its mandate for another 25 years to protect Kurdish interests in the region. The recommendation suited London perfectly. What the commissioners perhaps did not fully advertise was how heavily the geological reality of northern Iraq had shaped the diplomatic logic surrounding it. 1 year earlier at Baba Gurgur near the city of Kirkuk, something had been burning for as long as human memory reached. Ancient fire, fed by natural gas seeping through the ground, had lit that landscape for millennia. The Book of Daniel, some scholars argued, placed the fiery furnace somewhere in this same scorched terrain. In October of 1927, the engineers finally reached what was feeding those ancient flames. The Baba Gurgur No. 1 well erupted with a force that took 10 days to bring under control, releasing a column of oil so powerful it flooded surrounding fields and sent the smell of petroleum drifting for miles across the Kurdish foothills. It was among the largest oil strikes the world had yet seen. Britain had known something remarkable was likely down there. The Turkish Petroleum Company, a pre-war consortium assembled with British, Dutch, and German interests, had held the original concession for Mesopotamian oil. After the war, German shares were redistributed to French interests as part of the post-war settlement, and the company was restructured and eventually renamed the Iraq Petroleum Company in 1929. The name was new. The underlying arrangement, a carving up of resources extracted from land governed with bombers and political mandates, remained perfectly familiar. That carving reached its most explicit form with the Red Line Agreement of 1928. Drawn on a map of the Middle East, the Red Line enclosed the territory of the old Ottoman Empire, and every company that signed the agreement promised not to pursue oil concessions independently within that boundary. American companies joined British, French, and Dutch partners in the arrangement. The region's resources were, in effect, divided before they were fully discovered. The people living above those resources were not consulted. What had begun as a question about borders and ethnic communities had resolved into something rather more straightforward. Mosul stayed in Iraq because of what lay beneath it. The Kurdish aspirations raised by the League's own commissioners dissolved into footnotes. The ancient fires of Baba Gurgur now fed something entirely modern, a global industry whose profits would flow north and west, away from the desert and the mountains where the oil was found. Iraq had its territory. Britain had its mandate, its company, and its share of the line. The next question was whether the Iraqi state being assembled around all of this could be made to stand on its own. The next question, as it turned out, had a carefully managed answer. By 1930, Britain had held its Iraqi mandate for nearly a decade. The costs, financial and political, had grown harder to justify in London. The RAF bombing campaigns, the tribal rebellions, the endless expense of administering a territory the British public had never much wanted. Something had to change. And yet the oil was there, the strategic air routes to India passed overhead, and the Middle East remained too important to simply abandon. The solution was elegant, at least on paper. The Anglo-Iraqi Treaty of 1930 offered Iraq the appearance of independence while preserving everything Britain actually required. Under its terms, the mandate would end and Iraq would become a sovereign nation. In exchange, Britain retained the right to station Royal Air Force bases at Habaniya, west of Baghdad, and Shaiba, near Basra. British officers would continue to advise the Iraqi army. Britain would train Iraqi pilots, and Iraqi foreign policy would remain closely coordinated with London. The treaty ran for 25 years. Was this independence? Was it simply occupation reorganized under friendlier paperwork? In October of 1932, Iraq became the first former Mandate territory admitted to the League of Nations. Crowds celebrated in Baghdad. King Faisal, the Hashemite monarch installed by the British a decade earlier, presented his country's case to Geneva with evident pride. The flags went up. The speeches were made. And at Habbaniyah, RAF ground crews continued their daily routines without interruption. The oil, meanwhile, remained firmly within the architecture built by the Iraq Petroleum Company. Revenues flowed through the concession agreement. British and international shareholders collected their dividends. The Iraqi government received a royalty, though the terms were rarely negotiated from a position of strength. Sovereignty over the ground above the oil was one thing. Sovereignty over what lay beneath it was another matter entirely. Faisal himself understood the contradictions better than most. He had spent his entire reign navigating between British expectations and the demands of Iraqi nationalists who found his compromises humiliating. He had built something, a state where none had existed before, stitched together from Ottoman provinces, rival tribes, religious communities that trusted one another little and the central government less. It was fragile work, requiring constant personal attention. In September of 1933, traveling in Switzerland for medical treatment, Faisal I died of heart failure. He was 50 years old. The timing could hardly have been worse. His son Ghazi, 21 years old and temperamentally unsuited to the delicate balancing act his father had perfected, inherited the throne. Where Faisal had been patient and calculating, Ghazi was impulsive and drawn to the rising nationalist currents moving through the Arab world. The steady hand that had kept Iraq's competing forces in uneasy equilibrium was gone. Within months, the instability Faisal had spent years suppressing began to surface. Military officers grew restless. Tribal confederations tested the limits of Baghdad's authority. The Kurdish North, where the League's own commissioners had once recommended protections that never materialized, simmered with accumulated grievance. The institutions Britain had helped build were thin, their roots shallow, their legitimacy contested. Independence had arrived. But the infrastructure of British power, the bases, the oil concession, the treaty obligations remained intact beneath it like the ancient fires beneath the fields of Kirkuk, invisible from the surface but never truly extinguished. The fragile state Faisal had left behind would now face its severest tests without him. And Britain, watching from Habbaniyah, still held more cards than the flags of 1932 suggested. Among the minorities that Britain had recruited, armed, and relied upon to hold Iraq together, none were more loyal or more vulnerable than the Assyrian Christians. The Assyrians were an ancient people, Syriac-speaking descendants of Mesopotamia's pre-Islamic communities who had suffered catastrophically during the First World War. Ottoman and Kurdish forces had driven them from their ancestral lands in what is now southeastern Turkey and northern Iraq, massacring tens of thousands. Those who survived arrived in the British Mandate as refugees, stateless and desperate. Britain offered them a role. As the Assyrian levies, they would serve as a trained auxiliary security force, guarding RAF bases and maintaining order in areas where Arab conscripts could not always be trusted. They were disciplined soldiers, regarded by British officers as among the most reliable forces in the entire Mandate. In return, the Assyrians believed they had been promised something. Not in writing, not in any treaty that could be enforced, but in the accumulated weight of assurances from British administrators. A homeland, or at minimum a protected status, somewhere in the Northern Territories. A place where their community could survive. Those promises dissolved as the mandate ended. When Britain negotiated Iraqi independence, the Assyrian question was handled the way inconvenient questions are often handled by departing colonial powers. It was set aside, mentioned in vague terms to the League of Nations, and ultimately left to the mercy of a government that regarded the levies as a provocative British instrument within Iraqi territory. In the summer of 1933, Assyrian leaders attempted to cross into French-administered Syria, hoping to petition for resettlement. Iraqi border forces turned them back. The situation escalated rapidly. Clashes occurred between Assyrian villagers and Iraqi army units in the northern district of Dohuk. The Iraqi military response was overwhelming and deliberate. In August of 1933, in and around the town of Simela, Iraqi army soldiers and accompanying Kurdish irregulars killed somewhere between 600 and 3,000 Assyrians. The estimates varied, but the nature of the killing was not in dispute. Villages were systematically entered. Men were shot. Women and children fled into the surrounding hills. The operation was celebrated in Baghdad. General Bakr Sidki, who commanded the forces responsible, returned to the capital to a hero's welcome. King Ghazi awarded him medals. Britain protested mildly. The League of Nations debated. Raphael Lemkin, a young Polish lawyer watching from Europe, was so disturbed by the international community's failure to act that he began developing the legal framework that would eventually produce the word genocide. The Assyrians had served Britain faithfully. Britain had moved on. The Simele massacre revealed something essential about the state that the Mandate years had built. Iraq's new institutions had inherited not only British administrative structures, but also the habit of resolving minority questions through force. The precedent set in those August days would echo forward through decades of Iraqi history, long after the last RAF transport had left Habaniya. General Bakr Sidki returned from Somalia a celebrated man. Within 3 years, he would use that celebrity to make history of a different kind. On October the 29th, 1936, Sidki's aircraft circled low over Baghdad while his ground forces seized key installations across the city. Prime Minister Yassin al-Hashimi fled. A new government was installed within hours. It was the first military coup in the modern Arab world, and it announced, with brutal clarity, that the parliamentary system Britain had so carefully designed was essentially decorative. Sidki himself was assassinated within a year, shot at Mosul airport in the summer of 1937. The pattern he had established proved impossible to break. Between 1936 and 1941, Iraq lurched through 7 coups and a procession of governments, each one shorter-lived and more precarious than the last. Military factions, tribal leaders, and competing political blocs circled one another in a constant struggle for the levers of a state that none of them fully controlled. What filled the vacuum was ideology. The late 1930s brought pan-Arab nationalism flooding into Iraqi officers' messes and schoolrooms, carried on Arabic-language radio broadcasts and the writings of theorists who argued that the artificial borders drawn by European powers were wounds that had to be healed. Britain, France, and the entire mandate system were not just inconveniences. They were the enemy. And then there was Germany. As Hitler's Wehrmacht rolled across Europe with astonishing speed, a significant faction among Iraqi officers began asking a practical question. If Britain could be defeated, why continue accommodating it? Into this atmosphere came the death of King Ghazi in April of 1939. The young king, popular and genuinely nationalist in sentiment, died when his car struck a telegraph pole outside the Zuhur Palace in the early hours of the morning. The official verdict was an accident. Few Iraqis believed it. Rumors spread immediately that British agents had arranged the killing, and though no credible evidence ever emerged to support this, the story lodged itself in the Iraqi national imagination with extraordinary persistence. Thousands rioted in Mosul. The British consul there was killed by the crowd. Ghazi's heir was his 4-year-old son, Faisal II. Power passed to the regent, Abd al-Ilah, a man whose instincts were firmly pro-British and whose presence on the throne therefore guaranteed that anti-British sentiment would have a face to attach itself to. By 1941, the collision course was set. A group of nationalist officers known as the Golden Square had grown tired of waiting. With a regent they despised, a war in Europe that seemed to offer opportunity, and a German ambassador in Baghdad actively encouraging their ambitions, they prepared to act. What followed would bring British soldiers back to Iraqi soil and force London to confront the fragility of everything it had built. On the 1st of April 1941, the Golden Square moved. It was no April Fool's jest. Armored units rolled through Baghdad before dawn, surrounding the royal palace and seizing control of the national radio station. Regent Abd al-Ilah, worn just in time, fled the capital dressed in the clothes of a woman, eventually finding refuge aboard a British gunboat on the Shatt al-Arab waterway. Rashid Ali al-Gaylani was installed as prime minister, and the new government wasted little time announcing itself to Berlin. The timing could hardly have been more alarming for London. German forces were advancing in North Africa. Greece was falling. The Atlantic lifeline was under constant assault from U-boats. And now, the oil fields of Kirkuk and the pipelines running to the Mediterranean, arteries that fed the Royal Navy and the entire British war machine, were in the hands of men actively seeking German support. Winston Churchill understood the stakes immediately. Iraq was not a peripheral concern. It was, in his own assessment, vital ground, and he ordered action with characteristic impatience. British forces were already stationed at Habbaniyah, a sprawling Royal Air Force base 60 miles west of Baghdad, under the terms of the 1930 Alliance Treaty. When Iraqi troops appeared on the plateau overlooking the base in late April and demanded a halt to all British military activity, the base commander, Air Vice Marshal Harry Smart, refused. On the 2nd of May, British aircraft struck first. The siege of Habbaniyah had become a battle, and a battle had become a war. Germany did attempt to intervene, funneling aircraft and supplies through Vichy-controlled Syria. It was a lifeline that arrived too slowly and in too small a quantity to matter. British and Allied forces advancing from Transjordan and from Basra moved with speed that the Golden Square had not anticipated. By the end of May, the war was effectively over. Rashid Ali and the Golden Square officers fled to Iran and then to Berlin, where they would spend the remainder of the war as honored but ultimately useless guests of the Nazi regime. Abd al-Ilah returned to Baghdad in triumph. Britain had reasserted its position in less than a month. But the restoration of order carried a dark and permanent stain. On the 1st and 2nd of June 1941, as British forces paused on the outskirts of Baghdad and the old regime collapsed, violence erupted in the city's streets. It was the Farhud, an Arabic word meaning violent dispossession, and it fell upon Baghdad's Jewish community with sudden and devastating force. Iraq's Jews were among the oldest communities in the world, their presence in Mesopotamia stretching back to the Babylonian exile of the 6th century before the Common Era. In 1941, they numbered around 130,000, concentrated heavily in Baghdad, where they formed a vital part of the commercial and intellectual life of the city. For 2 days, mobs moved through Jewish neighborhoods. Homes were ransacked and burned. Shops were looted. Men, women, and children were attacked in the streets. The precise death toll has never been definitively established, but credible estimates place the number of Jews killed at between 150 and 180, with hundreds more wounded and thousands of properties destroyed. The causes were tangled, the responsibility disputed. Pro-Axis propaganda had spent years painting Iraq's Jews as agents of British imperialism. The collapse of authority in those suspended hours created a space that violence rushed to fill. For the ancient Jewish community of Iraq, the Farhud marked an irreversible turning point. The world they had inhabited for centuries had shown them what lay beneath its surface. Britain had won its war, but something had been broken that no treaty would repair. The guns fell silent over Baghdad in the first days of June 1941. For the second time in 25 years, British forces had taken the city. The first time in 1917, they had come as conquerors wearing the language of liberation. Now they returned as something harder to name, an empire enforcing its will on a nominally independent nation, a patron reminding a client exactly who held the account. Abd al-Ilah was restored to the regency. The young King Faisal II, still a child, remained on his throne. The political machinery of the Iraqi state resumed its operation, but everyone understood who now controlled the levers. What followed was not technically an occupation. Britain was careful about such terminology. Iraq remained a sovereign kingdom with its own government, its own flag, its own seat in international forums. But British forces stayed, and stayed in numbers that made the word sovereignty feel very thin indeed. Military personnel spread across the country's key installations. RAF bases hummed with activity. Advisors moved through Iraqi ministries. The infrastructure of informal control, built over 2 decades, was reinforced and expanded. This arrangement persisted until 1947, 6 full years after the tanks had rolled back into Baghdad. For most of that period, Iraq served as a crucial logistical hub for British operations across the wider Middle East. Supplies moved through Basra. Aircraft staged through Habaniya. The oil kept flowing. The men who had actually fought Britain were by then scattered. Rashid Ali spent his exile in Saudi Arabia and Egypt before eventually returning to Iraq in the 1950s, a ghost from a failed revolution. The Golden Square officers who had gambled on German victory found themselves on the wrong side of history. 2 of them were eventually captured, tried, and hanged. For ordinary Iraqis, the years of reoccupation carried a particular humiliation. The country had been given formal independence in 1932, celebrated it, built institutions around it. Now British soldiers moved through their streets again, British officers sat beside their ministers again, and the fiction of sovereignty required everyone to pretend they did not notice. The political consequences proved deep and lasting. The generation of Iraqis who came of age in the 1940s did so watching their country's independence treated as provisional, conditional, revocable at British convenience. Among them were young men who would spend the following decades plotting an end to that arrangement by whatever means proved necessary. The resentment seeded in those years would flower into the revolutionary politics of the 1950s and beyond. There is a question worth pausing on here. Was Britain simply defending legitimate strategic interests in a time of genuine global emergency? Or was the speed and ease with which it dismantled Iraqi sovereignty a demonstration that independence had never truly been granted at all? The answer, uncomfortable as it is, may be that both things were simultaneously true. What Britain defended in 1941 was real. The oil, the bases, the lines of supply, these were not abstractions. They mattered to the survival of the Allied war effort. But the manner of their defense exposed something that the treaties and the ceremonies and the careful diplomatic language had always obscured. Iraq's freedom had been real only so long as Iraq chose not to use it in ways that threatened British interests. The reoccupation would eventually end, but the political arrangements it reinforced, the monarchy, the regent, the pro-British governing class, would hold for another decade and a half. The reckoning, when it finally came, would be swift and utterly without mercy. By 1948, the architecture of British influence in Iraq had stood for 3 decades. Treaties, bases, advisors, oil concessions, the whole elaborate structure rested on governments willing to cooperate and populations willing to acquiesce. That January, both assumptions collapsed at once. The Portsmouth Treaty arrived dressed in the language of partnership. Signed on the 15th of January 1948 between British and Iraqi officials meeting in the English port city that gave it its name, the agreement proposed a revised framework for Anglo-Iraqi relations. On paper, it looked like progress. The old 1930 treaty, with its overtly colonial terms, would be superseded. Iraq would gain nominal equality. The reality was considerably less flattering. Britain would retain control of the RAF bases at Habbaniyah and Shuaiba. A joint defense board would coordinate military affairs, but the structure ensured British dominance over Iraqi strategic decisions. The oil arrangements remained untouched. For anyone reading carefully, the treaty was less a revision of the old order than a renovation of it, new carpeting over the same foundations. The Iraqi Prime Minister, Salih Jabr, returned from Portsmouth believing he had secured a reasonable deal. He was catastrophically wrong about the public mood. Baghdad erupted. What followed became known as the Wathba, an Arabic word meaning the leap. Students poured from university gates. Workers abandoned factories. The communist-aligned labor movement, which had spent years building quiet organizational strength, helped coordinate what became one of the largest popular demonstrations in Iraqi history. For several days in January 1948, the streets belonged to the people. the crowds were not peaceful everywhere. Police opened fire. Protesters died in the streets, the estimates ranging from several dozen to several hundred killed over the course of the uprising. Rather than breaking the movement, the deaths hardened it. The funerals became marches. The marches became larger. Salih Jabr fled Baghdad. The regent, Abdul-Ilah, reading the situation with the survival instinct that defined his politics, abandoned the prime minister entirely. The government announced it would not ratify the Portsmouth Treaty. The agreement was dead within weeks of its signing, repudiated by the very government that had negotiated it. For Britain, the humiliation was significant. A treaty painstakingly negotiated, celebrated in Portsmouth, had been destroyed by crowds in Baghdad's streets. The informal empire's machinery depended on cooperative local governments. When those governments proved unable to deliver cooperation, the machine jammed. The Wathba also revealed something important about where Iraqi politics was moving. The uprising was not led by the old tribal or religious establishment. It was driven by students, urban workers, and leftist organizers, the emerging forces of a modernizing society with no patience for arrangements designed in London. The Iraqi Communist Party had demonstrated genuine mass mobilization capacity. The old order in Baghdad, the monarchy, and its British patrons had survived. But they had seen clearly what was gathering against them. The Wathba had been a warning. The men who governed Iraq in London and Baghdad chose, fatally, to read it as a problem of crowd control rather than a crisis of legitimacy. By 1955, Britain had found a new vehicle for its ambitions in the region. The Baghdad Pact, signed in February of that year, brought together Iraq, Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, and Britain in a formal mutual defense arrangement. In London, the logic seemed impeccable. The Soviet Union pressed southward. A chain of allied states could contain it. Iraq would serve as the cornerstone, anchoring the entire Middle Eastern position. Nouri al-Sayed, the veteran Iraqi prime minister who had spent decades navigating between nationalist pressure and British expectation, threw his weight behind the pact entirely. He genuinely believed that alignment with the West offered Iraq security and modernization. What he failed to calculate, or perhaps refused to see, was how completely his own population had come to see him as a British instrument rather than an Iraqi statesman. Across the Arab world, a different vision was capturing imaginations. Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt had emerged as the defining voice of pan-Arab nationalism, insisting that true independence meant refusing exactly the kind of alliance that Nouri embraced. To follow Nasser's logic was to view the Baghdad Pact not as a security arrangement but as colonialism wearing a new uniform. In coffeehouses from Cairo to Baghdad, that interpretation resonated far more powerfully than anything Nouri offered. Then came Suez. In July 1956, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain and France, in secret coordination with Israel, launched a military operation that October to retake it. The United States, furious at being excluded and alarmed by the global reaction, forced a humiliating withdrawal. Britain had gone to war, failed, and been compelled to retreat by its own closest ally. The consequences for British prestige across the Arab world were devastating and immediate. Whatever authority remained after decades of mandates, treaties, and interventions evaporated in the weeks following Suez. If there had been any lingering argument that British power in the region was a force for stability or partnership, that argument collapsed entirely in October 1956. In Iraq, the effect on the Hashemite monarchy was corrosive. Every association with Britain now carried the stench of defeat and bad faith. Nuri al-Sayyid remained in power, but governing through increasingly authoritarian measures against opponents who were multiplying faster than his security forces could contain them. The army, educated, nationalist, and deeply influenced by Nasserist ideas, watched the regime's isolation grow. The Baghdad Pact had been designed to provide security. Instead, it had provided a symbol, proof, for anyone who needed it, that the Iraqi government served foreign interests before Iraqi ones. The monarchy had survived the Wathba of 1948. The question was whether it could survive what was now building in the shadows of Baghdad's military barracks. The morning of July 14, 1958 began like any other Baghdad summer morning, the air already thick with heat before sunrise. It would not end that way. 2 brigades of the Iraqi army, commanded by Brigadier Abd al-Karim Qasim and his co-conspirator Colonel Abd al-Salam Arif, had been ordered to move through the capital toward Jordan. The movement of troops through Baghdad was routine enough to raise no alarm. What the regime did not know was that Qasim's Free Officers movement had chosen this morning. The orders had been given. There would be no turning back. Units loyal to the conspirators moved swiftly on the Rehab Palace. King Faisal II was 23 years old, a young man who had inherited a throne built on sand and British patronage. He had barely governed. When soldiers entered the palace courtyard, the king, the regent Abd al-Ilah, and members of the royal household were brought outside. What happened next took only moments. The king and the regent were shot dead in the courtyard. The monarchy that Britain had constructed almost 4 decades earlier, installed with such careful calculation after the First World War, ceased to exist in a matter of minutes. Nuri al-Sayyid had not been at the palace. The veteran prime minister, sensing danger, had slipped into the city dressed as a woman, hoping to disappear into Baghdad's streets. He was recognized. He was killed. What followed was a measure of how completely the population had come to despise him. His body was exhumed, mutilated, and dragged through the streets of Baghdad by crowds who had spent years suffering under his authoritarian rule. The man Britain had relied upon as its indispensable Iraqi partner met an end that shocked even seasoned observers. By mid-morning, Radio Baghdad was broadcasting revolutionary proclamations. Crowds poured into the streets, not in protest, but in celebration. Whatever the violence of the morning, the jubilation was real and spontaneous. This was not a moment Baghdad had to be persuaded to accept. In London, the news arrived with the force of physical shock. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan convened urgent meetings. Could Britain intervene? Should Britain intervene? The questions were serious ones. British paratroopers were considered. Military options were drawn up, examined, and placed before ministers who had to weigh them against a world that had changed since the days when such interventions were simply executed without apology. The answer ultimately was no. The memory of Suez was barely 2 years old. The United States signaled no appetite for a counter-revolution in Baghdad. The Arab world's reaction to any British military move would be incendiary. Macmillan's government concluded, with whatever reluctance, that the monarchy was gone and could not be restored. Britain's last great strategic position in the Arab heartland had collapsed, and there was nothing to be done about it. The new Iraqi Republic wasted little time defining itself against its predecessor. Within months, Iraq withdrew from the Baghdad Pact, the alliance that had been designed to bind the country to Western security frameworks and that had, instead, helped seal the monarchy's fate. The British military presence and the agreements that had governed Anglo-Iraqi relations for decades were dismantled one by one. 4 decades of British dominance, stretching from the fall of the Ottomans through mandate rule through the managed independence of the Hashemite kingdom, had ended on a single summer morning. The state Britain had drawn into existence, staffed with friendly rulers tied with treaties and reinforced with airfields and advisors, had slipped entirely from its grasp. What remained was the question of what came next, both for Iraq and for British interests across a region that was remaking itself with remarkable speed. Qasim's republic was not the end of Iraq's turbulence. It was, in many ways, only the beginning of a new and equally violent chapter. And Britain, stripped of its instruments and its illusions, would find itself watching from an ever greater distance as the country it had made lurch toward its uncertain future. Qasim ruled for 4 years and found that governing Iraq was far easier than surviving it. He legalized the Iraqi Communist Party, broke with his co-conspirator Arif over pan-Arab ambitions, and navigated between competing factions with diminishing skill. On February 8, 1963, the Ba'ath Party moved against him. Qasim was captured, given a summary trial that lasted minutes, and shot. Decades later, declassified documents and testimony from CIA operatives would suggest that American intelligence had provided the Baathists with lists of suspected communists to be eliminated in the aftermath. Thousands died in the weeks that followed. The first Ba'athist government lasted only 9 months before being overthrown in turn. Iraq's cycle of coups consumed governments with mechanical regularity. Then, on July 17, 1968, the Ba'ath Party returned, this time with harder men and longer memories. They would not make the mistakes of 1963. Power, once seized, would be held through a combination of ideology, patronage, and systematic terror. Behind the party's official leadership stood a figure who had already spent years building the internal machinery of control. Saddam Hussein, then in his early 30s, understood that real power lived in the security services, not the cabinet. He expanded them patiently, placed loyalists throughout every institution, and waited. The nationalization of the Iraq Petroleum Company in June of 1972 severed the last direct economic connection to the British-designed order. The company that had been created from the ruins of the old Turkish Petroleum Company, the instrument through which British commercial interests had shaped Iraqi revenues for half a century, passed into Iraqi state hands. In Baghdad, it was celebrated as a second liberation. In London, it was simply absorbed as another piece of an already diminished relationship. Oil revenues, amplified by the price shocks of 1973, gave Iraq's government resources on a scale the monarchy had never possessed. The state expanded. The military expanded. And Saddam Hussein's grip on the institutions of both tightened year by year. On July 16, 1979, President Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr resigned. Within days, Saddam convened the Ba'ath Party leadership and delivered a speech that became one of the most chilling documents of 20th century authoritarianism. Names of alleged conspirators were read aloud. Men were led from the room as Saddam watched, smoking a cigar. Some of those remaining were compelled to join the execution squads. Absolute power had arrived. The borders Britain had drawn, the sectarian arithmetic Britain had never resolved, the oil wealth Britain had first extracted, all of it now sat beneath a government of singular brutality. When Iraq invaded Iran in 1980, Western governments, Britain among them, found ways to accommodate and quietly assist the man they now needed. The chickens, as one British diplomat might have observed privately, had come home in a very uncomfortable fashion. 32 years had passed since a British soldier last stood on Iraqi soil. Then, on the 2nd of August 1990, Saddam Hussein sent his armored columns rolling south across the Kuwaiti border, and the calculation changed overnight. The invasion shocked Western capitals, though perhaps it should not have. Saddam had telegraphed his intentions for weeks, massing troops along the border while diplomatic warnings went unheeded. Within hours, Kuwait City had fallen. Within days, the United Nations Security Council had condemned the annexation. And within weeks, the largest military coalition assembled since the Second World War was taking shape in the Saudi desert. Britain moved quickly. Margaret Thatcher, famously, was in Washington when the invasion came and reportedly stiffened President George Bush's resolve against any accommodation with Baghdad. Her government committed British forces almost immediately. Operation Granby, as the British deployment was designated, would ultimately place 45,000 soldiers, sailors, and airmen in the theater. The armored divisions of the 1st Armored Division pushed into the desert alongside American, French, Saudi, and Arab coalition forces. For many of the officers planning the campaign, the maps they studied showed territories their predecessors had administered as a matter of imperial routine. The air war began on the 17th of January 1991. For 38 days, coalition aircraft dismantled Iraqi air defenses, supply lines, and command infrastructure. British Tornado jets flew low-level missions against Iraqi airfields, suffering losses in the early days before tactics were adjusted. The sound of aircraft peeling away into the desert night, the distant percussion of anti-aircraft fire over Baghdad, the green-tinted television footage that brought the war into living rooms across the world. It was a conflict that felt simultaneously ancient and entirely modern. The ground offensive, when it finally came on the 24th of February, lasted 100 hours. The Iraqi army, hollowed out by 5 weeks of bombardment and poorly positioned to meet the sweeping left hook the coalition executed, collapsed with stunning speed. British forces breached Iraqi defensive lines, engaged Republican Guard units in the largest tank battle British armor had fought since the Second World War, and helped seal the route of Iraqi retreat. Kuwait was liberated. The Emirates oil fields, set ablaze by retreating Iraqi troops, burned against the sky, turned black at noon. And then the coalition stopped. The decision not to advance on Baghdad has been debated ever since. President Bush and his advisors concluded, with some legal and strategic logic, that the United Nations mandate extended only to the liberation of Kuwait. Pushing to Baghdad risked fracturing the coalition, occupying a country of 22 million, and opening questions no one had answers for. British commanders broadly concurred. But the halt came at a cost that was paid by others. Encouraged by coalition radio broadcasts and by the scale of Iraq's military defeat, the Shia population of the south rose in rebellion in early March. Kurdish communities in the north followed. Saddam, permitted to keep his helicopter gunships under the ceasefire terms, used them without mercy. The uprisings were crushed. Tens of thousands died. Coalition forces sat at their positions and watched. The images from southern Iraq in the spring of 1991 would haunt Western policy for years. Britain had returned to Mesopotamia, liberated one country, and then watched as the population it had once governed was massacred within earshot of its lines. The ghosts of 1920 had not been exorcised. If anything, they had multiplied. And across the following decade, as sanctions tightened and Saddam endured, the unfinished business of 1991 would fester into something that demanded, or so its architects believed, a final resolution. The ceasefire that ended the Gulf War did not end the conflict. It transformed it into something slower, quieter, and in many ways more lethal. United Nations sanctions, first imposed following the invasion of Kuwait, remained in force throughout the 1990s with British and American support. The logic was containment, starve the regime of revenue, deny it the materials to rebuild its military, compel compliance with weapons inspections. The reality as the decade wore on was something more troubling. Saddam's government adapted, consolidating control over what little remained and ensuring the ruling elite survived comfortably while the population beneath them did not. By the mid-90s, Iraq's health system had effectively collapsed. Hospitals lacked medicines. Water treatment plants, damaged in the war and denied repair parts under sanctions rules, failed across the country. In 1996, the United Nations Children's Fund estimated that the death toll among Iraqi children under 5 had risen by 500,000 since the sanctions began. When an American interviewer asked Secretary of State Madeleine Albright whether that price was worth it, she answered controversially that it was. Britain largely maintained the same position. The no-fly zones added a military dimension to this slow pressure. Operation Northern Watch patrolled the skies above the 36th parallel, protecting Kurdish communities from the regime. Operation Southern Watch covered the south, where the Shia uprisings of 1991 had been crushed. British aircraft flew thousands of sorties throughout the decade, occasionally exchanging fire with Iraqi air defenses. It was a war that never officially existed, grinding on year after year in near silence. An attempt to address the humanitarian disaster came through the Oil for Food program, launched in 1996. Iraq could sell limited quantities of oil, provided the proceeds funded food and medicine rather than armaments. In theory, a workable compromise. In practice, the program became riddled with corruption on a spectacular scale. Saddam's government manipulated contracts, extracted surcharges, and built networks of illicit payments that touched politicians and officials across dozens of countries. The people the program was meant to feed remained hungry. Then, in December 1998, patience with Saddam's repeated obstruction of weapons inspectors finally broke. Operation Desert Fox, a 4-day Anglo-American bombing campaign, struck over 100 targets across Iraq. British aircraft and Royal Navy submarines contributed cruise missile strikes. The inspectors were withdrawn and would not return for 4 years. Desert Fox settled to nothing. Saddam remained. The sanctions remained. The slow death continued. In Washington and, increasingly, in London, a different conversation was beginning. Containment, the argument ran, had failed. The unfinished business of 1991 required a permanent answer. Regime change moved from the fringes of policy toward its center. The question was no longer whether Saddam Hussein would be removed. The question was when, and on what pretext, and who would go in afterward. On the morning of February the 15th, 2003, something extraordinary happened in the streets of London. More than 1 million people marched through the city, the largest demonstration in British history. In Glasgow, Rome, Madrid, and Sydney, millions more joined them. The signs they carried were simple. The message was unambiguous. Do not do this. Tony Blair did it anyway. The case for war had been building for months, assembled in public with a confidence that, in retrospect, should have invited more scrutiny. In September 2002, the British government published an intelligence dossier claiming that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction capable of being deployed within 45 minutes. The press seized on the claim. Parliament debated it. Downing Street promoted it aggressively. What few knew at the time was how heavily the document had been shaped not by raw intelligence but by political pressure to make the strongest possible case. When a BBC journalist reported that the dossier had been sexed up, the resulting scandal would eventually consume careers, launch inquiries, and end in tragedy. The document became known simply as the dodgy dossier, a phrase that entered the language permanently. None of it stopped the invasion. On the 20th of March 2003, coalition forces crossed the border into Iraq. British troops, around 45,000 of them, operated in the south, assigned to take and secure Basra. The city fell within weeks, and here history delivered one of its most unsettling ironies. The same city that British Indian forces had captured in November 1914, the very first significant British conquest of Mesopotamia, was falling to British soldiers again, nearly 90 years later in what many observers were already calling a new imperial adventure. The parallels were not lost on historians or on Iraqis. Baghdad fell on the 9th of April. The statue of Saddam Hussein in Firdos Square was pulled down before cameras broadcasting worldwide. American officials spoke of victory. President Bush stood beneath a banner reading "Mission Accomplished." The war, it seemed, was over. It had barely begun. What followed the military victory was a catastrophe of planning, or rather of its near-total absence. The American administrator Paul Bremer disbanded the Iraqi army in May, sending hundreds of thousands of trained, armed, and now humiliated men into unemployment. The Baathification stripped the civil service of its experienced administrators. Electricity failed. Water failed. Museums were looted while coalition soldiers stood by. The institutions that had held a brutally governed country together were dismantled without anything to replace them. Into that vacuum poured everything that Saddam's iron grip had suppressed. Old sectarian grievances between Sunni and Shia communities, political scores to settle, criminal opportunism, and genuine ideological fury at the foreign occupation all merged into an insurgency that coalition forces were wholly unprepared to counter. By late 2003, soldiers were dying not in the decisive conventional battle they had trained for, but in roadside bombings, ambushes, and assassinations. Basra, under British control, initially seemed more stable than Baghdad. It would not remain so. Shia militias, some backed by Iran, began competing for power in the south. British forces found themselves caught between factions they'd barely understood, in a city whose politics had been transformed beyond recognition by the invasion they had carried out. The weapons of mass destruction, the entire justification for the war, were never found, because they did not exist. 179 British service personnel would die in Iraq before the mission formally ended. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians would perish. An entire region would be destabilized for a generation. The inquiry that eventually examined Britain's role, led by Sir John Chilcot and published in 2016, concluded with quiet devastation that the invasion had been unnecessary, the intelligence manipulated, and the planning for the aftermath wholly inadequate. Empire's echo had sounded again. And once again, the consequences would be felt by the people of Iraq long after the soldiers had gone home. Basra in the summer of 2003 had the surface appearance of order. British commanders spoke cautiously of a softer approach, of winning hearts and minds, of a different kind of occupation than the one unfolding in Baghdad. Soldiers patrolled without helmets in those early weeks, an image that commanders hoped would project confidence and calm. It projected something else entirely. Within months, the helmets went back on. The militias came quietly at first. Groups loyal to the cleric Muqtada al-Sadr, others backed by Iranian money and training, moved into the power vacuum left by the collapsed state. They controlled neighborhoods, then police stations, then the institutions of local government itself. British forces, understaffed and under-equipped for a long-term counterinsurgency, found themselves increasingly unable to move freely in a city they nominally controlled. Improvised explosive devices, the signature weapon of the insurgency, began claiming British lives with grim regularity. The death toll accumulated slowly, which in some ways made it harder to confront. 179 men and women in total, killed across years of patrols and convoys and firefights in the southern desert heat. Each death announced on the news, each flag-draped coffin arriving at RAF Lineham in Wiltshire, added to a national unease that the government struggled to contain. What, precisely, were they dying for? In 2007, British forces withdrew from the Basra Palace compound and retreated to the airport on the city's edge. The militias celebrated in the streets. American commanders, fighting their own desperate battles further north, made little effort to disguise their frustration with what they considered a British retreat. The claim that this represented a deliberate drawdown rather than a defeat satisfied few observers. By September 2007, Basra was effectively governed by the militias Britain had been unable to suppress. Formal combat operations ended in 2009. The last British troops left without ceremony, without the kind of conclusive victory that might have justified the enterprise. The war had lasted 6 years. It had cost billions of pounds. It had delivered not the democratic model for the Middle East that its architects had promised, but a broken city handed to armed factions. Then came the reckoning. Sir John Chilcot had been appointed to lead his inquiry in 2009. The report he eventually published in July 2016 ran to 2.5 million words. Its conclusions were delivered in the measured language of a civil servant, which made them no less devastating. The legal basis for the invasion had not been adequate. The intelligence had been presented with a certainty that the evidence did not support. The planning for the aftermath had been wholly insufficient. Tony Blair had committed British forces before peaceful options had been exhausted. The inquiry did not accuse Blair of lying in the criminal sense, but it left little room for the defense that he had simply been mistaken. Blair emerged to face the cameras and express sorrow without accepting that the fundamental decision had been wrong. Critics found this response as inadequate as the intelligence dossier had been. Families of the dead stood outside and wept. The Chilcot Report joined a long list of official inquiries into British adventures in Iraq, stretching back through the decades to the Mesopotamia Commission of 1917, which had condemned the disaster at Kut with similarly careful language. History had repeated itself with remarkable fidelity. The same overconfidence, the same inadequate resources, the same failure to understand the country being invaded. Britain's long entanglement with Iraq, born in the trenches of Mesopotamia over a century earlier, had reached its bitter conclusion. What it had left behind would shape the region and the world for generations to come. What does a nation owe the country it invented? The borders Iraq inherited were not drawn by Iraqis. They were sketched in 1916 by a British diplomat named Mark Sykes and his French counterpart François-Georges Picot, men dividing a map of a region neither had deeply understood. Kurds in the north, Shia Arabs in the south, Sunni Arabs in the center, communities with ancient distinctions and rivalries were gathered inside a single set of lines and told they constituted a state. The consequences of that decision are still being counted. When the Islamic State swept across northern and western Iraq in 2014, capturing Mosul in a matter of days, it did not simply represent the rise of a new extremist movement. It exposed something older. The Iraqi state cracked almost exactly along the fault lines that British administrators had papered over a century before. Sunni communities, alienated by years of sectarian governance in Baghdad, offered little resistance. Kurdish Peshmerga fighters moved to secure their own territory. The fiction of a unified Iraq, always fragile, nearly collapsed entirely. The Kurds remain the sharpest illustration of promises unmade and unmended. Nearly 30 million people spread across 4 countries. They were offered a homeland at the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, then watched that promise dissolve 3 years later at Lausanne when British strategic interests shifted. A century on, the Kurdish question remains exactly that, a question, unresolved and politically inconvenient to everyone with power over its answer. Gertrude Bell had understood some of this. She had walked through Mesopotamian villages and read its poetry and warned that Mosul and Basra and Baghdad held different peoples with different loyalties. Her maps were precise. Her warnings were largely ignored. The oil beneath the ground was not ignored. From the Anglo-Persian oil company's early concessions through the nationalization crisis of the 1950s to the arguments over Kirkuk's reserves that continue today, petroleum has distorted every relationship between Iraq and the outside world, Britain's included. The Chilcot Report documented the most recent failure. But Britain's history in Iraq is not a single failure. It is a pattern. Overconfidence at the moment of entry. Underestimation of local complexity. Inadequate planning for what comes after. Then departure, leaving behind structures too weak to hold. Can imperial powers ever truly leave the nations they created? The evidence from Iraq suggests they cannot. The borders remain. The sectarian arithmetic remains. The Kurdish aspirations remain. And somewhere in the relationship between those enduring realities and the choices made in London offices over the last 100 years, the answer to that question sits waiting. Britain's story in Iraq did not end with the last soldier leaving Basra. It continues in every parliamentary debate about intervention, every refugee crisis, every eruption of violence along lines drawn by men who are long dead. The map they drew is still the map people are dying on. Britain's fingerprints remain on every border, every crisis, and every conflict that defines Iraq today. Subscribe for more histories that reveal the forces still shaping our world.